figure out how the people that are going to operate the space are going to work together. In the wiki right now, we're saying that people who are going to start a hackerspace should consider registering as a nonprofit organization in their state. Registering as a nonprofit in your state is not the hard part. The hard part is seeking 501c3 tax-exempt status from the IRS. Well, guess what? Hacker Foundation already did that. If you organize as a nonprofit group in your space and have a stated mission that falls in with the IRS's definition of nonprofit, we can provide 501c3 tax-exempt status so that you can go out there, collect donations, and get people to donate to your hackerspace and get a tax write-off on their federal taxes for it. After you organize as a group and know how you're going to work, start planning. You have to do needs assessment, budgeting, figure out how you're going to raise money, and figure out how the space is going to do what it sets out to do. Third phase, after you've organized, after you've planned for what you want, you know what you're looking for. You can go out there into the commercial real estate market, know what kind of spaces would work well, what kind of spaces you might want to fall back on, and what kind of spaces you want to avoid. And that you know going into it, as a legal nonprofit, you can sign as a legal nonprofit on that space. So that if everything just happens to fall apart...
It goes off a kakva. Bad. It goes bad?
If it goes bad...
That's what fakakva means, people.
Okay. If it goes bad, you don't have one person who's left out there holding the bag. Next phase, after you've signed a lease, after you have keys to a space, you have to take all of these plans that you made in step 2 and build it out. Figure out what you need to do, get there, figure out, if you need electrical contractors, if there's something that you can do on your own, or some friend of a friend that happens to be associated with the group that can help them do that. That's what the build-out phase is all about. And now that you've got the keys, now that you've got the hackerspace, now that everything's up and running, you have to figure out how you're going to keep it going for as long as you possibly can, hopefully indefinitely. And that's what the sustaining phase is about. And through all of this, you can help illustrate how your hackerspace is going to meet the mission of the Hacker Foundation. If we're going to be providing the 501c3 cover for your local outfit, you have to be able to demonstrate. In the event that we get audited by one of our donors, in the event that we get audited by the IRS and they're looking through all these different things, you have to have on paper something to show the IRS saying that, yes, this is a tax-exempt project. First step, organizing. Like I said, we strongly recommend, if you want to, and granted there are advantages and disadvantages to this, to starting a nonprofit registered in the state that the hackerspace is going to be in. This process involves, filling out a form and paying a fee to the state, writing your bylaws, figuring out how things are going to work, and acting like a nonprofit organization, which has a board of directors and meets every so often. Maybe the board of directors are the 5 people in that space, and that you meet every so often, you have meeting minutes, you do things like this. A lot of this is not complicated. One of the reasons HSI is around is to help you do that as simply as possible. After you've started your local nonprofit organization, that's when you talk to us. You say, hey, okay, we've done this. Now, how do we formalize the relationship so that we can say to people, yeah, if you donate to our hackerspace, you get a tax write-off. Once that part is done, you can go out there and you can start fundraising. Money that the 5 core people who are in that hackerspace are putting into it should be able to be tax-deductible donations. The 5 people who are putting it in can write off on their taxes. If you end up shelling $3,000 of your own money into the hackerspace, you should be able to write that off on your taxes. And then another critical part of the organizing outfit is deciding who you want to serve specific roles. If there's somebody who's a strong leader in your group, they should be the president. If there's somebody who doesn't have really great leadership skills, but they have really great organizing skills, they should be the secretary, the vice president. If there's somebody who aced all of their accounting classes, you probably want them as your treasurer. And you have to really think about that when you're starting and organizing your spaces. Who's going to do what key critical things? Going into the second phase. Now that you've got your organization, you know who's involved, you know what they're going to be doing, you have to figure out, well, what do we want to do with our hackerspace? Who do we want to be? How do we want to present ourselves to the public? What are we going to be contributing to the public good? One very critical thing about a hackerspace is who gets keys. You might not want to have everybody involved in your group to have keys to the space so that they can get to it 24/7. But you want to operate it as a public good. You have to work out, well, are we going to be open 9 to 5 so that people can stop in and maybe get help with something or can look at our project? You have to figure out how you're going to work it. If there's other groups that want to utilize your space, you have to figure out, well, how are we going to allow them access? Are one of the core organizers going to be there to open up the space for them? Are they going to drive by, give them the keys, and then lock up the space and they're done? This is a very, very critical thing because if something goes wrong, if somebody's switch or valuable piece of equipment gets stolen, you're going to want to figure out who had access to the space at any given time. And of course, you have to figure out in this needs assessment phase, how are the things that we want to do in planning serve the exempt purposes that we set out to serve at the beginning. Also in the planning phase, and this is obviously very important, figuring out where your money is going to come from. If the space costs $1,000 to rent every month and you've got 5 people involved, is everybody in a position to donate $200 a month? And you have to work this out. Odds are that the people who you're going to start your hackerspace with have all varying different levels of income. And you have to figure out if there's somebody who's making a lot of money, are they willing to put in for the term of the lease, maybe 3 times as much as everybody else? These are the sort of, long drawn-out things that lead to a death of a hackerspace that if you work out in advance, you can keep the hackerspace going. Another thing, maybe all 5 of you are totally flat broke, but you know how to raise money. You know how to get people involved. You know how to get people enthusiastic about your space. You know how to use the space as a public good and get resources from the community so that you don't have to pay the rent bill all by yourself. And of course, once you know where your money's going to be coming from, once you've worked that out, you can figure out what are all your expenses. It doesn't matter how effective your planning is, there's always going to be some expense that you haven't thought about. But the things that you know about in advance, rent. You got to pay the rent on the space. Utilities. If you have a hackerspace, you're going to have a big power bill. There's no way around it. It doesn't matter how many wind turbines or solar cells you use. Computers use a lot of juice.
It's called the budget plan, kids.
Right.
Learn it, love it.
And another thing, not every commercial space out there is wired for 220. Maybe you want to have 220 power going into that. Often if you have access to commercial power rates, they tend to be cheaper. And if you can if you can think about that ahead of time and say, yeah, we want to get cheap, dirty industrial power instead of paying, residential clean power, we want to do that. But you have to talk to the utility company before you can have that happen, and you have to budget for it. A lot of times, if you're going throughout a commercial venture, there's a lot of money that you're out there. And if you're a nonprofit and if you have no credit history, they're going to want a deposit to make sure that they're not totally wasting money for doing all this stuff to get your hackerspace wired the way that you want it wired. Another critical thing is furniture. Where's it going to come from? Is everybody in your space
IKEA.
going to take all of the stuff, all of the racks, all the chairs, all the tables out of your basements and just donate it to the space and put it in the space? Fine. You don't have to worry about that. But maybe if you have more artists in your group, maybe if you have more creative types in people, you're saying, I've seen a lot of these, all the cool furniture and the setup and all this stuff that they have in Germany. I want to do that. You have to plan for that. That's a big expense. And then finally, when you occupy a space, when you get commercial space normally, it's just a blank box. You're going to have to do something other than furniture. You're going to have to figure out where you want to put your power, where you want to put your network, if you want the space to be reconfigurable, if you want the space to be one set thing, if you want to have a server room that nobody can get access to, you're going to have to build that and figure out what it costs to build that. And then after you've satisfied these things for the space, you have to figure out, well, what are the sorts of things that we want everybody to have access to? Do we want to have a budget to go out and buy tools? Do we always want to have a spool of Cat 5 available? What are the sorts of, in less set, less concrete things that we want to offer? This is when you go back, you look at your planning. Well, if we always want to have a spool of Cat 5, we have to figure out how much Cat 5 we're going to need. Are we going to have a constant supply of ends? Who's going to have access to that? These are the kind of costs that you have to think about before you can even go out and sign a lease on a space. But once you've got this sort of thing done, you can go into the fun part, going out there and looking at spaces. How commercial real estate works is very different depending on what market you're in. If you're on the East Coast, if you're in New York, renting commercial real estate works a lot differently than it works in San Francisco, which works a lot differently than it works in Chicago, Atlanta, things like that. You have to know your commercial real estate market. Oftentimes, it might be more helpful to try looking for spaces in areas that are undergoing gentrification. Just old plants that are out there that are sitting empty that they just want to rent. They just want to have people in the space so that there's people in the neighborhood going to the coffee shops, and they'll give it to you for $1 a square foot. Great. If you can find a space like that that's really cheap, that's really great, that fits your needs in your community, go out and get that. But maybe you're like, well, I don't want to be in a gentrified space where there's a cool coffee shop now, but then Starbucks is going to move in. Well, maybe you want to be in the industrial urban core. Maybe you want to be where all of the professionals are. New York, if you're looking at commercial space, the Empire State Building is actually a pretty good deal for where it is. Wouldn't it be cool to have your hackerspace, if you live in New York, in the Empire State Building? You can do that, and it's really not that expensive, but you have to look at it. And of course, again, when you're going out there, you have to look at your budget analysts for given space, for the lease. Commercial leases are a pain, but then again, this is where HSI can help you. We have access to people with expertise who know how commercial real estate works, who can look at a lease that a landlord gives you, figure out if there's anything abusive, if there are any illegal lease clauses there, if there's little ticking time bombs. A lot of people are going to need it. A lot of commercial real estate people are going to want insurance. A lot of others just roll the cost of insurance into your overall rent payment. But if you have a lease agreement there and the commercial real estate who's dealt with people who've always dealt with commercial real estate in that space just automatically think that you're going to go out there and get insurance, you have to know that. You have to read the lease very, very carefully. If they require insurance, you have to go out and get it. Because if your landlord comes back 4 or 5 months later and says, oh yeah, hey, you guys forgot to send us your certificate of insurance, and if it says in the lease you need to have insurance or we can kick you out in 24 hours, the commercial landlord can go in there, move all of your stuff, kick it out on the street, and then hope that the people who actually own it can come pick it up. That's why you have to be very, very careful. Commercial real estate is even worse than residential real estate. That's why acquisition is its own rough phase in and of itself. And of course, if you've got the 5 people, you're going to want to decide, okay, well, are we going to trust one person to go out there and lease the space? Or are we all going to split up, look at all the different neighborhoods, take one, and then pick one space in that particular neighborhood that we're going to audition for the rest of the group and decide? HSI will help you go through this phase to decide what you want in the market that you want it. And obviously, this phase ends when you have the lease, you've looked it over, you know exactly what you're signing, and you're signing it on behalf of your organization. Going into the build-out phase. Now that you've got your space, you know what you want to put in it, you have to build it. This phase is complicated because even the most careful planning, there's always going to be things that you didn't anticipate. Maybe all of those outlets that were in your space that made it look so great, well, maybe only half of them are actually wired for power. This has happened before. And you have to figure out, well, do we want to wire all of those different things, or do we want to come up with a plan B? In the build-out phase, once you've planned, and now once you know what space you have, you can take all those different things and lay out a floor plan. You can decide, okay, well, do each of us want a different space? Great. Where are we going to put it? How's it going to work? How's it going to work in relation to our server room? Are we going to want to have all of our computers and our lab be half of the space, and then have the other half of the space be a public area where anybody can do whatever they want? This is very complicated, and it takes a lot of getting into to determine what your floor plan is going to be, what it's going to cost, and what the advantages and disadvantages is of various different ways of laying things out. Once you know what you want to build, you have to go out and generally, depending on your lease clause, obtain permission to do it. If you want to move walls, if you want to build walls, if you want to rewire outlets, depending on your lease, depending on your power company, depending on who your local telco is, you may have to get permits and permission to do this. And then once you have that, you got to go out and buy it, you got to go out and do it, you got to do the building. If you're rewiring electricity, you want to have a licensed electrician do it, unless there's somebody who you know is either really good at wiring it or really doesn't mind being electrocuted.
Jen, do you have anything to add to that? Jen wired her own
And just so that you guys know, Jen Gergen, B9 Punk, who's down here, is sort of the fairy godmother of the Triple H, the hackerspace that we mentioned in New York. And as we've been going through all these
Godmother like Godfather. Okay, it's like that, like the Godfather.
She's been down here laughing throughout my whole speech because all of the different scenarios that I've outlined, she's lived through about 80 to 90% of them.
She's done them wrong.
She's done them all.
We just went through it, oh, what'd they do wrong? Uh-huh, uh-huh,
okay.
uh-huh, uh-huh.
All right.
Reversed them out.
Now that your hackerspace is all set up, everything's good, everything's the way you want it, you have to figure out how are we going to keep this thing that we invested so much time and energy in, how are we going to keep it going? A couple of the things that we think hackerspaces should be doing, if you've got a group of 5 people, you should be meeting regularly. You should know who's staying involved, what their plans are for the near-term future, what their plans are for the long-term future, and you should sit down and resolve problems before these problems become miscommunications, which become misunderstandings, which lead to phase 5 and the death of your space. You have to ensure that what you guys are doing is equal. You have to figure out, are we all playing the roles that we set out to do when